Assess sound and data.
Roger Dean, why don't you describe your position and your interest in the relationship of sound and data, just to start out.
Okay, well, I'm a musician and a researcher, and currently my research is in perception of music and cognition of music, and particularly in things like timbre perception, rhythm perception, affect perception. And so I've been those two things, musician and researcher, my whole career, and I've always tried to bring the two together. And currently I'm in the stage where they're coming closer and closer together. Early on I was a biochemist, so they were very far apart, but I still did both at a very serious level. And now they're close together, and things like deep learning, algorithmic approaches, sonification to a limited degree. I'm not big on sonification. David Worrell's much.
Yeah.
But anyway, those I think which are examples of the interface that I do find fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the part that interested me was your sort of scientific, like your day job was this biology thing.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe there had been some bleed over, but, and I always ask this of anybody I'm talking to regarding sonification, have you ever had anything that you worked on relative to turning data into sound scale? In other words, be more than just a boutique project that you're working on, local to your interests in music, and you know what I'm saying? I mean, like the sort of the practicality of sonification. So far, there's nothing except for the Geiger counter and a few other things that have efficacy, and I'm sort of searching for that.
Right. I think you're asking about utility as information transfer.
Right.
In scientific sense, if I'm understanding you.
Exactly.
And if so, yeah. my answer is certainly I don't think I have. And I also, I've been quite sorry to see the relative lack of progress in the research area in sonification with respect to that. I mean, there's still very few tests beyond those ones which are to do with making sonification useful for blind people, for example.
Yeah.
Still very few tests of efficacy, as you put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's a limitation from a scientific point of view.
Yeah, it's a real interesting phenomenon because I've been involved with this since 95, 96 when ICAD first started up, and interviewed Greg Kramer about it. We had all these expectations about what would happen, that it would just be moving right along with SIGGRAPH and like that. But and the reason why it doesn't happen is very complex and related to the strength of music as a thing, I think. I mean, I'm starting to realize. But our take on it, and because I'm working very closely with Roger, who's more interested in the science side than the art side, which I respect, is to use your area of research of cognition as the keystone way of getting into this, of making efficacy out of the way people want to listen to sound, if you understand that,
Yeah, I do understand. I mean, the one major sonification that I made with David Worrell and Greg White was for an ICAD in 2002. I don't think you were there. It was in Sydney.
Yeah, no, I didn't come to that one, no.
Yeah, we had a 24/2 system in the Opera House, and it was actually less effective, our piece, than it was in David's own geodesic dome. But it was a sonification of EEG, brainwaves.
Right. Oh, I remember that whole piece. I thought about going. It was where I was at that time. It didn't make sense. But that's a really interesting challenge that you put forward at that ICAD.
That's right. I think it was Stephen Baras's idea. But
right.
Yeah, it was a good challenge. But as you say, none of that was assessed. I remember talking to Greg about it too. None of that was assessed from the point of view of information transfer. And it's wide open to do that, I think.
It's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, even just as an adjunct to all the very rich visual information. I don't know. Have you heard of Alexandra Super by any chance?
I don't think so.
She's a sociologist in Maastricht, Belgium, that's wrote a very interesting thesis about what she calls the auditory sublime. And it's kind of what gets in the way, because everybody has this expectation and even claims that the sounds that they make from data from Jupiter, therefore here's the sounds of Jupiter. Well, they're not. They're like a mapping based on taste and technology, and so there's this confusion about the sublime nature of sound itself,
Absolutely, yeah. And only yesterday I heard a neuroscience talk where somebody said exactly the same thing. Here's the sound of the cerebellum.
Yeah.
And while it was a very interesting
red flag.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't bother to go into it because it wasn't important to the talk. But
yeah.
I agree with you, yeah.
It's a thing that happens, and it's the expectation. It's almost like a cultural expectation of our representation, our sonic representation, having some sort of. I'd go back to Pythagoras and Kepler, the music of the spheres kind of thing. Well, it's interesting that Kepler introduced the eccentricity of that there weren't perfect circles, these orbits, and they weren't really in harmonic relationship to each other in terms of just intonation or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's this expectation of the sublime that doesn't happen.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I tried to sell the idea of sonification to the capital markets research cooperative we have in Australia, which actually did give David and I a little bit of money. They just weren't interested in it really when it came down to it. And I think the reason there was that they probably didn't put enough value on the speed with which sonification in principle could provide new information, so much faster than a visual display.
Well, and also the cognitive load of auditory stuff is much more multidimensional, discretely multidimensional. But maybe your research would bear that out. I don't know.
So, do you mean to imply that it's more efficient?
I think it would be if you can simultaneously discern, let's say, 6 dimensions, which is something you can't do visually.
Yeah. Well, that was exactly the argument that I ran to these people.
Yeah.
Because they have screens with, in a trading floor, they have screens with maybe a dozen different visual images of things going on, locally or wide. And so I said, this can be much more efficient, but they wouldn't buy it. I think the same thing applies in the airplane cockpit. The sound is not as big a part of it as you might think. As far as I'm aware, the main place where it really is successful is the oil industry and other aspects of geology. Yeah. There's a big usage, I believe, still. And we don't really know, I don't know much about it because it's not published, is it?
No, I mean, that's all proprietary stuff. I did get a little bit close to that. It was part of what was interesting about going to Dallas for me.
Yeah.
But they've done some work. I just conjectured that this is what they're doing from core samples of old mud logging.
Yeah.
So if they're going to drill near an old site, they'll look at the old mud log and listen to it. It's much easier to listen to it than it is to analyze it visually. Yeah. But
that's another question of speed. I mean, they can hear a million years worth of soil in 50 seconds or whatever it is.
I've identified another problem, I think, and I'd like to run it by you since you've been at this as long or longer than I have, and that is the idea that we keep saying sonification like it's one thing, but the more I work on this, the more I realize that it's like saying visualization is one thing. I mean, it isn't. There's like pie charts and there's histograms and blah blah blah, and there's all these unidentified, unstandardized sonification techniques that are absolutely not the same as, in my opinion, anyway.
I totally agree. And I mean, I think that one of the difficulties one comes to is that you almost inevitably have a very continuous stream representing many of those dimensions that you want to sonify.
Right.
It's like, in Lee Landy's terms, it's kind of sound-based music or sound-based rather than note-based sound or music, isn't it?
Right.
And so there you come to another layer of perceptual problems which we are beginning to grapple with in the field at large and in my work, for example, about timbre perception. We just published a paper 12 months ago or so, which was about what is a phrase in, if you like, sound-based music. Continuous streams of sound, no notes, no rhythm. What is a phrase? And, we don't know that kind of stuff. And I think we would need to know that kind of stuff to, A, optimize the sonification, and then, B, assess its interpretation.
Well, and the big thing we're talking about is standardizing those things. I don't know. Do you know the stuff at MIM, the TSU's temporal semiotic units? Have you heard about that?
Vaguely, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, it's a thing where they tried to codify for electroacoustic music this idea of types of phrases, if not the actual phrase itself.
As far as I'm aware, that was not followed by empirical studies of whether those typologies were deep.
No, I think
you could start at both ends.
It's weird because, I mean, as soon as you start making sound, it suddenly turns into art, and then the sort of rigor of objective analysis, which it sounds like you're totally into with the cognition stuff, it goes away. It's always been a challenge, you know. Like I said, I backed into this from the art world, but now that I'm in it, I mean, trying to figure out. And then we have an additional problem, and I'd be curious to get your input on this. We're trying to take it out of the science context and do performing, but try to get objective understanding of what's happening in a performance from the audience's perspective. Are they getting some richer understanding of finding something in a performance context? Is there a transfer that?
I mean, that's a great objective, isn't it? I should imagine it's rather difficult to set up the experiment convincingly.
Well, luckily, I'm involved with this theater company where the guy doesn't mind having some of the characters be in lab coats with clipboards going around in this sort of amorphous audience with multi-scenes going on simultaneously, asking questions. So that's our current scheme. You know, it's a little crazy, but...
Yeah, I should think it would be fun, yeah. But I do think it's a difficult problem. I mean, I think it's somewhat similar to the problem that we face in generative music of assessing the computational generative side of things, particularly in a context where there's both the computational and the individual performer responsible for generation, when it's co-generation, if you like. And I've designed some experiments for that purpose that we're going to use with our deep learning, but they're not going to be easy. I think it's going to be extremely difficult, and I think it'd be at least as difficult in the context you're talking about. I mean, even going to an audience situation to do an experiment is difficult in itself. We've done that here with Kate Stevens has done it with dance, and we've done it to a limited degree with music as well. That already becomes difficult, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, looking at your biography, I get this picture of you as a very solid musician. First as a bass player, as a young man, and then as a pianist, accompanist. You know, if I've got that right. So you understand what changes. I also have a very strong musical. I can read music. I've written string quartets. You know, I know the literature of 20th century and 19th century music, that kind of stuff. But my participation in the hub allowed me this kind of other musical experience that's very unique and very much based on reactions to what the computer, or at least the network, was coming up with. That is probably in the same zone, if I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, no, it is in the same zone. And I mean, my group, Australysis, we do a lot of related things too. We never were a network ensemble in that sense, but we always had multiple computational machineries going at once, or several at least, together with live acoustics. And so I think it is a very similar challenge for the musician. It's exciting, it's great, it's stimulus, but it's also a difficult one from the point of view of deciphering perception and cognition of it.
Right. And I mean, I was always astounded. We'd be doing this procedural-based music based on whoever's piece, you know, there's specific outlines of how to do this piece live as a live performance. And people would come up afterwards and say, and I was seeing like the surface of Venus and all this. You know, going, oh, wow, cool. You know, that's not something that we were doing, by the way.
No, quite. It wasn't data sonification.
This is the crazy problem of the whole thing, is everybody's got their cultural influences that just pile on, you know. Anyway.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think the point you made about the non-translucency, the fact that everybody has their codes, both at the producing end and at the perceiving end, is very critical. I mean, that's why from a musical point of view, I always try to break down a lot of those codes. You know, for example, I'm interested in post-metrical and post-tonal, as you are.
Yeah.
And then similarly, you know, I developed a new scale which doesn't have any octaves and doesn't have any fixed ratio interval things, a prime number scale, which I've used quite a bit in microtonal music. And now I'm interested in the idea of using prime numbers to produce pieces which have a single metrical cycle across the whole piece. You know, whereas normally we're used, even in African music as well as Western music, to cycles which repeat temporally quite frequently.
Well, that's funny. Well, with this piece of this theater company, I'm using the overtone series to organize events. So the fundamental is the length of the whole thing, and then at a halfway point, all the even numbered things are going to change suddenly, and likewise for everything in the fifth, and you know. Anyway, it's along those lines. Yeah.
Mine's going to be probably further out in the sense that all the ratios are going to be based on prime numbers. So
well, that's all. Yeah,
it'd be like harmonics, but nevertheless, it's it's a great idea, isn't it? I don't think many people have done stuff like that, as far
Well,
as I can tell.
and who knows if someone can even, I mean, it might be the kind of organizing principle that people won't be able to perceive unless you really make a point of it. I've always hated going to concerts where I have to read like 2 pages of notes before I can listen to the piece. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
That's always
yeah.
it's kind of a taboo thing, you know?
Well, they may not perceive what we know was there, but they may perceive something just as important, in my view.
Well, I did this one piece. I had a chance to work with the neural net synthesizer that David Tudor used at the end of his life.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Mark Haller was a friend of mine, and he let me do it. And it was in his garage in Palo Alto, and I was playing a gig at the Stevens Institute, and I was controlling the neural net synthesizer in his garage, and he was ice casting the audio off of it to the live performance. And I just didn't even mention it in the notes. I mean, it was the most complex, you know, it just would have taken, you know, pages and pages of explanation of what was going on. And I was just kind of curious if I could pull it off, really. And so...
You're right. Yeah. Of course, it's interesting you mentioned neural nets there, because, of course, deep learning is all about neural nets. And Google's one of their latest enthusiasm, Doug Eck and company, is the neural synthesizer, which is it's a bit like going from an FFT to an IFFT, a fast Fourier transform to its inverse and getting the original back.
Right.
Only instead of doing it with the sound, with an analysis of the sound, they're doing it with the embeddings, which are an analysis of a mass of sounds informed by the particular sound they're trying to recreate.
Right.
I mean, this is quite interesting stuff, I think.
I think so,
only
too.
operates on a short time frame, but it's good stuff.
Yeah, the Magenta project, those piano pieces that it generated.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about the Magenta project.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Yeah. I mean, my deep learning approach, which I'm tongue-in-cheek calling deep improviser, is a bit more experimental than theirs. I mean, because I said post-tonal, post-metrical, etc. So I'm trying to generate rather different stuff, but it's the same fundamental deep learning approach.
You're just picking up after George Lewis's Voyager, right? Because he was doing this stuff, but you know what I mean. In 1990, I saw that, it was just like mind blowing. He's running fourth on an Atari ST and playing amazing trombone, you know, and his DX7 was reacting very sensibly. But yeah, of course, this is much more sophisticated with the kind of tools we have now. But yeah.
Well, I mean, since Max came along, I've been doing it too since about 1992 or whenever it was.
Right.
But as you say, George was a pioneer.
Amazing.
So was Roger Smalley, actually, the British Australian guy.
Yeah.
I just got a new CD of his that Chris Tonkin and people in Perth made. It's beautiful, and it has all the pieces that I heard as an undergraduate student in Cambridge when Roger was a research fellow. It's great stuff.
Yeah. There was a kind of a blip right there in the 90s, and it kind of has subsided. But I think it's the Magenta project. I look forward to hearing the stuff that Australis and yourself are working on. We're getting to the point where we're going to integrate machine learning into our sort of more cognitive, but we're going back to basics and trying to figure out, I mean, what's the sonic equivalent of a pie chart, for example? Or how do you express, what are the different ways you can express a ratio? And how do you train the listener to understand that the thing they're hearing represents a ratio, you know, which is, you know, kind of a challenge, but interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as you said before, that's extra difficult because of the fact we're used to thinking of 12-tone Western music and as soon as you get something away from that, you got the danger of so-called categorical perception that somebody perceives it as one of those familiar ratios when it's actually not. And we're doing some experiments on that on tuning systems.
Oh, really?
Not easy. Yeah, I've got a PhD student who's working on 22 text, and also I've had some papers published on irregular tuning systems, including that one I mentioned with prime numbers, where there are no octaves and no interval ratios at all.
You know, who's both? James Beaucamp and some I talked John Chowning. He's very interested in the kind of molding of the spectral, like an artificial spectrum, like in Straya, I think it was the piece of his, where he made one based on the golden mean. I mean, that's very early work in the same area, but he's trying to confuse the difference between spectrum and intonation, or blur them, you know, or maybe mix them.
Well, I have a colleague. I have a brilliant colleague here, Andy Milne, who has a theory of how we perceive these tonal or other tuning system intervals, which is based on the idea of spectral similarity between chords or tones. This is very closely related to what you were just talking about. I mean, as as is a paper that Andy and I did about spectral approaches to rhythm. We had a paper in Computer Music Journal which resulted in an app called Chronomorph.
Oh, yeah.
Chronomorph, the next, as opposed to the Messiaen piece.
I'm aware of that, actually. I read it.
Yeah, and that's all about rhythmic subdivisions which are not symmetric and not necessarily integer ratios and things like that.
Oh man, and so working in cognition is really interesting then. So you can do kind of an A/B comparison to the conceptual model to the actual what the listeners are actually perceiving.
Well, yeah, sort of. I mean, a lot of scientists are very, very reductionist. They want to have a short A and a short B, say a bit a timbral dissimilarity test. Right. But I tend to try and do something where we have essentially a whole piece of music. It's usually only 2 or 3 minutes worth, but try to get the same kind of information about how that stuff operates within real music, which is in some ways more difficult. In other ways, it's complementary and I think useful. So yeah, we're right into that.
Jim Tenney's harmonic or spectral canon. This is the piece of this area of.
Yeah.
Something came up when you mentioned your friend doing the 22 TET tuning. One of my favorite things that Jim Horton, the late great League of Automatic Music composer, he did a 13 TET, which is just about the most horrible tuning you can come up with.
So there's a great paper on 13 TET from I think from the 70s.
Yeah,
even.
I think he was probably riffing on that.
Roger Smalley was in the 70s, of course, too. But coming back to him, but the paper I'm thinking of was very interesting from exactly the point of view exactly what we're talking about, perception of ratios. Because what happened psychologically was that the 13 notes apart, if they were literally placed an octave, were perceived as an octave. But the 13 notes, if they were placed apart such that it was slightly more than an octave, were still categorically identified with the octave. It's a bit like piano tuning, only it was much more extreme. It was quite a few more cents out at the end. I've forgotten how many. And it was categorically bound into the ordinary octave. People didn't notice that it was something beyond an octave.
That it was way out of tune.
Yeah, exactly. But when you get to the top, I mean, I've actually had that experience working with Piano Tech and using their various tuning systems, and suddenly I was playing something down the bottom, which I expected to be a minor third, and it was sounding like a major third, and I was thinking, what on earth is going on here? Then I suddenly realized it was their stretching tuning system, and I better get it off.
Yeah, right. I remember accidentally sitting down at a piano that Terry Riley had tuned to, I think, a 7 limit, and I just started playing, and I went, what? I didn't realize that, this piano's really out of tune, and then I realized, oh, wait,
Yeah. That's a bit like the bit clavier, isn't it? The thing from Princeton,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Come across that software, detuned and prepared piano. It's great.
So in terms of intonation, are you doing a lot of research with cognitive understanding of intonation, or is that just something you're interested in artistically?
Well, it's not intonation in the sense of continuous intonation flux that we're doing. It's really different tuning systems and how those are perceived. And for example, the question of whether they do have the kind of hierarchies that we are believing are common in Western music, where we don't really know whether it's primarily our exposure to it and the way it's been used historically, or whether it's something psychoacoustic and fundamental, or both, most likely both. So once you come to a foreign tuning system, by which I mean unfamiliar, previously unheard, then you can ask those kind of questions. That's the sort of thing we're doing. A couple of our people have been doing that. Yvonne Leung and Gareth Hearn, for example, have been doing good stuff, I think.
Well, it's always been a fascinating area. We always brought elements of that kind of intonation into our work off and on with the hub. And when I worked with Lou Harrison, I realized some tuning tapes that were based on his work in the 50s, actually, with a mutable 1-1, where you would decide what had been the third was the 1-1, and everything would kind of what they call it freestyle tuning. Yeah.
Well, actually, one of the other thing besides the metrical cycle, which is once only in a piece and lasts 10 minutes that we were talking about, I'm also interested in the kind of a analogous thing to do with pitch. So in the deep learning thing, of course, the Magenta project, that what they want to make is commercial, popular music, etc. So they use 12 TET, they use quantization of the rhythm. They have an expressive version, sampler RNN, but it's basically conventional tuning and harmony. So I went to the other extreme. So I actually set up a representation where I can have a continuous pitch flux. And while so far most of the stuff I've used it for experimental purposes, for scientific purposes, has been 12-tet, I plan to use it for a kind of pan microtonality, you know, where there'll be every possible pitch used in every possible relationship.
Right. It'll be interesting. I think there's probably some cultural artifacts that have to do with us listening to 12 tone equal. I remember that, or at least this might be apocryphal, but Bach supposedly preferred mean tone to the equal temperament when he heard it late in his life. And that's what he was familiar with. And if you know that, it kind of drives how you listen to what he's doing in like the well-tempered clavier and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, there have been one or two really interesting scientific papers about perception of different tuning systems. I mean, for example, one by Josh McDermott and Oxenham, which is about what are the influences upon both Western people and people in a place in Bolivia, if I remember rightly, who had very different background exposures, and they were radically different in their perception of consonance or liking of, you know, pitch combinations in a way which you could attribute primarily to roughness or inharmonicity characteristics. They actually separated the two experimentally. It was good stuff.
Partridge's one-footed bride, right?
Yeah, but experienced by people who've never heard anything.
Especially not Partridge. That song about Barstow. Always a crack up. But anyway, well, okay. Well, we could go on and on. I guess, okay, where we arrived wasn't really about sonification to me, but still has to do with sound and data. I think, I mean, an area, one of my takeaways from, I mean, and I've been really focused in on this, and I've in the really amazing opportunity to pretty much 24/7 be working on just the conceptual models behind all this. And that is that a mistake that's made, and I'd like to get your comments about it, is that people assume that someone who's doing a sonification is usually a very sophisticated listener. And so I can make things that are, in hindsight, have very subtle differences and assume that the people listening to it are going to hear the differentiation between like and, you know, but to them that's the same sound. It's kind of in the same area of the cultural difference of intonation. Do you have any thoughts on that or experience?
Well, I know exactly what you're talking about, but I think there's quite a mixture of people in sonification, aren't there? I mean, there's some people who primarily come at it from an engineering or DSP kind of background, and there are others like us who come at it from a background that, in listing, is dominantly informed by musical taste. So I think there's a sufficient community there that one should be able to deal with that bias, if you like. But it just hasn't happened fully yet, has it?
No, I mean, it's all baby steps. Everything about sonification, from my perspective, is just absolutely nascent. And just at the beginning, still, even after 20, 30 years, 40, really.
Agreed. I mean, the last time I went to an ICAD was 2013 or 14 when it was in New York. And, I mean, I presented a kind of polemical poster about the need for us attacking the issues that we're talking about of data representation and what actually happens and so on. And, you know, there was a blissful silence in response to
I have this one paper about visualization and sonification. I don't think it's poorly written, and it's been rejected 4 times now. And it's very polemic, I'll admit, you know. And I usually submit it to visualization people saying, hey, you know, let us in. You know, we need the same sort of level of financing and cognitive research that you're getting, you know, for all your stuff. Or that's not exactly what it's up to. But I mean, you know, it's maybe a badly written paper that could explain why. But I don't think so. I mean, because I have other papers that are less polemic.
If you get suggestions how to make it clearer, you can obviously do that, can't you? It doesn't sound that's the problem to me.
Maybe the first time I thought that was the problem, but not the fourth time.
No. Maybe you should try one of the journals like Music ECNTE, which is I'm an editor, so I've got a bias in favor of it, of course. But the guy who's the key editor, he's really open to a diversity of stuff. He would be very interested in it, and you would be sure of getting a really good consideration.
At least good feedback about what's wrong with it. That there is this sort of cultural chasm. Just like there's a bias towards men in science, and there's a bias towards visualization in science representation.
Yeah.
And okay,
Yeah,
one last
absolutely.
question front, but
Yeah.
and that is relative to sonification. Are you going to integrate it in your research, or are you more going to stay on the? Well, you'll probably stay on the cognition thing more.
I think I will stay on the cognition and the creative side
Yeah.
fundamentally. In other words, the idea of the data driving the representation and then testing that is something I think is very interesting, but it's not something that's going to come to the top of my agenda. I don't think. I mean, one just has to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
amongst these.
I have the. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a blessing or a curse, but because I mean, it's really pulls me away from the musical thing to do it authentically, and that's been a kind of a conceptual problem for me actually, because I really think of myself as a performer and a composer first, and so. But we are integrating very strongly into the cognition area, so I'm probably going to reach out again to you, because there are aspects of this that, that really need the kind of background and support in order to make the point about the sort of unintentional but very real cognitive problems of trying to do authentic sonification.
Yeah, well, that would be great. I mean, when I did that polemical poster, I did suggest experimental types and how they could be done. I mean, one of the big things, of course, is from a psychological point of view, is avoiding what's called demand. In other words, avoiding focusing somebody on telling you the right answer because of the way you put the question. And I think that's going to be quite difficult for data representation, because one is going to have to say something about what kind of data it is that you're trying to transmit before you'll have much chance of transmitting it, I think. So one would have to wander through some of those conventional psychological issues, I think, and it would be exciting to do.
Yeah, I think so. It is a big topic, and we just have to frame it correctly in order to get the support that's needed. And I don't think there's anyone so far who's actually gotten that. This last DARPA project that we did came close, but one of the problems is as soon as you involve artists, then it sort of gets split away from the objective part of it, which is a good thing, but also a bad. So this is why we're sort of looking at the idea of performance as an out of the laboratory way of getting some kind of metric on what people are perceiving, and which folds into your work quite well, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, while I said I didn't plan to do experiments of the kind that we were talking about unless I helped collaborate with you for something, then nevertheless, I still use bits of data as the basis for peace, like we all do, but not in a way where, whether or not they're informationally represented remains important, because I usually transform the data before it gets too far in the system, like I guess you would often do.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, I have one kind of joke sonification piece I did with the Hub called "The Sonification of Global Consciousness," which was based on the Noosphere. It's kind of a like a send up of all these people. Oh, this is the sound of the galaxy or whatever, and it was just basically random numbers coming off of Roger Nelson's Noosphere thing at Princeton, So it was like kind of a send up, but
I think I've heard that one. Yeah,
it works as a piece, because we're. And that one's much more of an improvised. Going back to the very beginning of our conversation, the point at which the Hub was improvising compared to when it wasn't. That there's a framework that's very improvisatory. So it's not like it didn't improvise. It's just that sometimes it's very procedural and really. There are a couple pieces that, like Wax Lips, is this piece by Tim Perkis where we could walk away from the network and it was playing. It was like this life game cellular automata thing.
That's on one of those CDs of yours, I think, isn't it? And I've certainly heard it.
Yeah, there's two of them. Das Lied von der Nerd was the subtitle of Wax Lips 2. But anyway.
Right.
So I really look forward to hearing more of your music, and maybe we'll break it open a little bit and broaden.
Okay. You already had David Warren,
I
didn't
did,
you?
but if you have I haven't talked to him in probably 2.5 years, 3 years, something like that. And now he's at Columbia, right, in Chicago?
That's right, yeah.
So I'm sure he's going on with his research.
Yeah, I hope so. I think he's very busy, but I hope so. I'm still in touch with him, so I hope so.
Well, I've kind of drifted. I followed what his suggestion lead, and we're working all in Python and C Sound now, which is like his Sonipy thing, and but using these Jupyter notebooks. I don't know if you know about them.
Yeah, that's what I used too. Yeah, I mean, I was part of Sonipy actually. That was something that came out from David's thesis when I was co-supervising him.
I see. Well, that's one of the.
I'm on the paper.
I got to say that the philosophical exposition at the front of his dissertation is excellent, and whenever I taught sonification, so you probably had a hand in that as well. It was very.
Only a small one, but yes, I think it is good. You're right.
It's a very sophisticated look at the kind of historical roots of even wanting to do something like sonification. Anyway.
Yeah. And similarly, I think he did a jolly good chapter in the computer music handbook I did a few years back.
Well, it's funny, as I was in you and I had exchanged, that we were going to talk to each other, and then I just happened to be in a half-price book in Dallas last week when I was doing and I came across it for, I think I'd had it. It might even have been my copy that somebody no, because I can't remember anyway. So the algorithmic one, the Oxford Handbook of Algorithmic Music came out. That looks very interesting as well. I wish these Oxford handbooks weren't quite so expensive. Is the only thing, It's
Absolutely, they're terrible pain, aren't they? No, I'm very happy with it, except for the fact that the OUP contract changed, and I lost a couple of great authors because they wouldn't sign the contract, and I didn't blame them. I'd already been fighting about it. But putting that aside, I think I'm very happy with it. And Alex and I were really quite complimentary. You've got such a different outlook from mine, being a pioneer like coder, that it was great.
Yeah. Well, it looks real solid. I haven't had a chance to read all the articles. There was I don't know if you saw this, a lot of people had the option to publish it themselves, so they're putting it up on so you can download several of the articles that the authors have taken their own personal copies and put it up online. So,
yes. They're not the, I'm aware of that and happy about it, but they're not the final version, so they're pre the edits. But nevertheless, they got most of the content.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to get it anyway, but Anyway, that's such fantastic work. I've been tracking everything you've been doing for all these years, and it's really great that Roger Molina, our mutual friend, made the connection. And like I say, let's do this again. You reminded me I should call David Worrell again and see where he's at and get an update on his view on things. And so thank you, Roger. This is fantastic, and I really look forward to having an in-depth conversation over a nice glass of wine or something. Okay.
Great. Very good. Thank you very much. It's
okay,
a pleasure.
Ciao. Sound and data.